Some people pretend out of ambition, but others pretend out of the longing to be loved as their true self, without the spotlight, judgment, or a name. In a world where wealth and lineage define every relationship, a young woman chose to become invisible to see who truly wished to step into her heart. This is not the story of an heiress, but the journey of a girl searching for something money could never buy, a love that needed no justification. And then, destiny found her in a small café in the heart of Cambridge. Not in the way she had expected, but in a way that would forever change both of their lives. The autumn sunlight bathed the red bricks around Harvard Square in gold, and through the lingering mist came the sound of indie music playing from the ceiling speakers of Third Rail Coffee. Isabella Cross was wiping down the espresso wand with a microfiber cloth and a dark t-shirt snug beneath her terracotta apron, looking no different from any other student working a part-time shift. No one could have guessed that the girl sliding steaming cups of coffee across the counter was the sole heiress of Cross Dominion Media Group, a media empire worth $14 billion, holding controlling stakes in news networks, film studios, and newspapers from the East Coast to the West. She had once worn Cartier, once sat beside governors at her father's fundraising galas, once spoken at the Global Youth Forum in Geneva, all part of a life she had deliberately left behind for 3 years. Only one reason. Isabella wanted to be loved not for power or fortune, but for who she truly was. A girl who loved classical poetry, melancholy jazz, and the scent of old books. Her name now was Isabella Gray, a fabricated surname, meticulously built by her family's private legal team, complete with school transcripts, bank records, and carefully curated social media down to the smallest like. That evening, while she was brewing another batch of cold brew, a warm baritone voice cut through. "Excuse me, 1 cappuccino, and perhaps a date?" She looked up and met the sharp green eyes of a tall young man with tousled brown hair, a James Baldwin book in hand. He wore a smoke-gray cashmere sweater and boots she recognized as bespoke, ordered from a private shop in Austin. "You want to date a barista?" Isabella asked, hiding the flicker of a smile in her eyes. "No," he said. "I want to date the girl who reads The Fire next time on her break, and who has eyes that look like they're listening to the whole world even when no one's speaking." He extended his hand. "I'm Landon Hayes." The name sent a chill down Isabella's spine. Hayes, son of Wyatt Hayes, the Texas oil tycoon who had recently pivoted into clean tech investments on the East Coast, a family that once held significant stakes in Southern media. Not on the level of Cross Dominion, but still one of those names fortune was always eager to feature. "Isabella," she said, pausing ever so slightly. "Isabella Gray." It started with coffee, then turned into late-night texts, and soon an evening when Landon took her to Morella's, a small Italian restaurant behind Harvard Square. No glamour, no paparazzi, just seafood linguine and red wine poured from a scratched carafe. "What have you been reading lately?" Landon asked. "Between the World and Me," by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Isabella replied softly. "And you?" "I've been trying to get through Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, but sometimes I think I should learn how to live simply before analyzing inequality in wealth." Isabella laughed, a real laugh, so unguarded she didn't even realize how much of herself she had just revealed. She hadn't laughed like that at a Davos media summit, nor beside her father at a podium. Then Landon asked, "What about your family?" She glanced at him, then turned away ever so slightly. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 16. I survived on scholarships and part-time jobs." The story was rehearsed, polished, backed by forged records, and planted articles. But in Landon's eyes, there was no pity, only respect. "You're strong," he said. "I don't think I would have survived losing everything at that age." And right then, Isabella realized she was beginning to love someone, all while carrying a lie. The girl sitting in the cracked leather chair of that little Italian restaurant was not Isabella Cross of Forbes 40 under 40. Still, no matter her origin, a woman recklessly chooses to love like any other young woman would. That night, Landon walked her back to her small apartment on Garden Street, with its second-hand oak desk and a framed picture hiding traces of her real life. Before leaving, he said, "This Saturday, My mother's hosting a charity gala in Savannah. I want you to come with me. Isabella Cross. I don't think I fit into your world, she said, forcing a light laugh. You fit into everything, Landon replied, because you make everything feel real. And with those gentle words, a storm quietly gathered inside Isabella. A storm not born from love, but from the price she would one day have to pay for loving under a name that wasn't hers. The train whistle wailed from Cambridge Station. Her heart pounded as she imagined meeting his mother, enduring the gaze that could strip away every truth. But she nodded. And so, the masquerade had begun. Isabella sat on the red-eye flight from Boston to Savannah, the cabin lights reflecting in her eyes like secrets unspoken. In her suitcase lay a navy dress, custom-made in a small Brooklyn atelier. No label, no logo, but cut with flawless precision. It was the kind of dress expensive only in the way someone raised amid refinement could recognize, modest enough not to invite questions. The Hayes family home stood 10 minutes outside downtown Savannah, built in the grand antebellum style. Wide porches, white columns, and ceiling fans turning slowly like a reel from the American South of the 1,960 seconds. As the car passed through wrought-iron gates, Isabella felt like she was entering a realm where the past and power were woven together in silk, and no one dared wrinkle. Vivian Hayes, Landon's mother, waited on the steps like a general guarding her family's frontier. She wore an ivory silk gown, a strand of real pearls on her wrist, her smile refined, but her eyes betraying scrutiny. She did not look at Isabella as her son's companion, but as if she were inspecting a suspicious artifact that had suddenly appeared in the family's collection. "You must be Isabella Gray," she asked, extending her hand. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for having me," Isabella replied, her smile steady, her handshake firm, polite, yet showing she had nothing to hide. "Call me Vivian," the woman answered, though her gaze lingered on every detail of Isabella's attire. Beige shoes, fine leather, hand-stitched seams, manicured nails with no polish. Everything is correct, but the kind of correctness is unusual for a part-time barista orphaned young. Dinner unfolded in a glittering dining hall beneath Waterford crystal chandeliers, sterling silver cutlery, and Lalique crystal stemware. Isabella sat beside Landon, across from Vivian and his grandfather, Conrad Hayes, founder of Hayes Petroleum, who was once featured on the cover of Time for sealing oil deals with the Middle East in 1984. Vivian's questions came gently but pointed. "What books do you enjoy? Which high school did you attend? Have you traveled to Europe? What's your view on America's withdrawal from Afghanistan?" Isabella's answers were measured, yet she never hid her intellect. She spoke of reading post-colonial literature, the importance of independent journalism in the 21st century, and how the warmth of other suns had left her weeping for 3 nights. "You seem to understand the world quite well," Vivian observed, her tone airy but sharp as a razor. "Not quite what one would expect from such a modest background, wouldn't you say?" Landon squeezed Isabella's hand under the table. She only smiled softly. "I think books are the only thing that can break down class barriers without violence," she replied, her eyes locked with Vivian's. "I read a great deal. The public library raised me." Vivian fell silent for a beat, then shifted the subject to art. "What did you think of last week's auction of Picasso's Woman with a Book?" she asked, like tossing bait. Isabella nodded. "Fascinating. It is one of the rare pieces in which Picasso used a pink palette after his blue period. I thought it would exceed 60 million, but it closed at 53.1, likely because the provenance wasn't entirely clear." Landon stared at her, surprised. She had never spoken of art before. Vivian sipped her wine. "And you learned that from which library?" "Perhaps from memory," Isabella answered with a smile. "The memory of things I never had." The meal ended with pecan pie and Italian espresso, but the questions had deepened into a genuine unease in Vivian's eyes. Later, in the parlor, Landon held Isabella close and whispered, "You were incredible. My mother can find weakness in anyone, but you didn't give her a single opening." Isabella smiled wistfully. "Are you sure I didn't?" Landon looked at her, voice firm. "If there's something you haven't told me, you'll share it when you're ready. I trust there's a reason for your silence." His words pierced her heart. for the reason she stayed silent was fear. The next morning, in her private study, Vivian reviewed a report printed by a private investigator. She narrowed her eyes at the line, "No record of Isabella Gray before 2020, no past photographs, no social media, no verifiable transcripts, a fabricated identity." She circled the last line in red. "Highly probable. This is not her real name." "Then who are you?" Vivian murmured, her eyes cold as steel. "And what do you want from my son?" Outside, Isabella admired the blooming camellias in the garden, unaware that the first covert battle had begun. From this moment on, every step she took inside the Hayes household would be tracked by the gaze of a mother who had spent her life protecting her family's power, even at the cost of her son's happiness. Returning from Savannah, Isabella thought she had passed the most challenging test. But what she didn't know was that while Landon held her from behind on their last night in Georgia and whispered, "I've never seen my mother so gentle with anyone before," Vivian Hayes was in a closed-door meeting with her private attorney, independent investigators, and a behavioral psychologist. "I want to understand her," Vivian said, elegantly crossing her legs over the walnut table. "It's not just that the girl is lying. I want to know why." The investigation widened. Operatives were planted as administrative staff, Harvard students, even professors, each trying to get close to Isabella Gray. Yet every thread ended in a dead end, as though she had materialized out of thin air 2 years earlier and stepped seamlessly into a role she was born to play. In Cambridge, Isabella and Landon continued their romance in the calm before the storm. They strolled through Boston Common on Sunday mornings, shared gelato, and read Langston Hughes aloud on wooden benches. She began to sink into the sweet and dangerous illusion of safety. One evening, Vivian appeared unexpectedly at a small investors' gathering in Back Bay. She invited Isabella over to a Kandinsky painting in the center of the room and asked, as if casually, "Is that Composition 7? I'm not certain, but isn't the original in the Tretyakov gallery?" Without much thought, Isabella replied, "No. This one belongs to his post-war sketches. The palette carries less energy, likely a 1942 work, if you notice the marking in the lower corner." Vivian's smile was thin, like someone who had just caught a fish in her net. "You know quite a bit about art, don't you, Isabella?" "I just read a lot," Isabella answered, a hint of hesitation. "Do you often follow Sotheby's auctions?" The question came sharp, like a sudden blade turn. "No. I couldn't." Isabella froze. Her tongue faltered, afraid to reveal too much. Vivian saw it. Her eyes narrowed like a laser. "You know," she said, "but you're not ready to admit it." That evening, Vivian phoned Landon. "Are you sure you know who she is?" "Mother, don't start. She can distinguish a real Kandinsky from a study, analyze European monetary policy, speak 3 languages, drink wine like a Paris-trained sommelier, and wear Stuart Weitzman shoes you can't buy off the rack. Does that sound like a poor orphan girl to you? You're being paranoid." "No, I'm being precise, and you're being led on without knowing it." Landon hung up, torn inside. Yet he did not confront Isabella, still trusting his heart. Meanwhile, Vivian moved to phase 2 of her plan, planting doubt inside her son's love. She dropped subtle barbs into his daily life. "Don't you find it strange she never mentions high school friends? Isn't it odd she knows so much about Italian wines for a struggling student? I just worry you're in love with an illusion, not a person." Each phrase, each drop, like acid seeping into a crack. Isabella began to sense the shift. Landon grew cautious, guarded. One night, when they dined at an Argentine restaurant she had recommended, he suddenly asked, "How do you know so much about Malbec wines?" She startled. "I read. I like to learn, down to vineyard names, vintages, acidity, and food pairings." He chuckled, trying to play it off, but his eyes no longer carried the carefree trust of before. Isabella knew she was slipping. The very traits that had drawn him, her poise, intellect, refinement, were becoming evidence for suspicion. Inside Landon, the conflict grew. When Vivian invited Isabella to lunch at Etoile in Beacon Hill, a restaurant her own mother had once funded in its first year, Isabella nearly dropped her glass when Vivian ordered her favorite dessert. Normandy strawberry cheesecake. You do like this one, Vivian said with a cutting smile. Only those who've tasted it at Chateau de Brissac could truly know the difference. Isabella said nothing. She set down her fork and knife, her fingers cold as stone. How long do you intend to keep lying to my son? Vivian whispered, leaning forward. I know, and sooner or later, Landon will know too. You don't know anything. Oh, don't I? I know you're not Isabella Gray. I know you were born in a granite townhouse on Fifth Avenue. You attended La Rosie in Switzerland and spoke at the World Forum at 19. Still, she stayed silent. But most of all, Vivian pressed, eyes unblinking. I know why you came to my son. And believe me, love isn't on that list. Isabella rose to her feet. You may uncover the truth, but you cannot change this. I love your son. And he once upon a time loved me. She walked away. Each step peeled back another layer of her disguise. Behind her, Vivian sat calmly, sipping her coffee, satisfied like a hunter who had pierced the heart of her prey without drawing a gun. The two women cut each other with silence, history, and love for the same man in this duel fought without blades. Only one could keep her secret, and the other was determined to destroy it to the end. The penthouse where Landon and Isabella lived together on the 46th floor of a Boston glass tower was no longer a place of warmth. It felt cold, as if the transparent walls were peering in, exposing the long silences between them. Isabella knew something was coming, like the feeling before a storm. No sound, no warning, yet unmistakable. Landon grew more pensive each day, his eyes no longer the same. He didn't ask directly, but every glance and hesitation before a simple question became an indictment without words. Vivian Hayes did not wait. After 6 weeks of gathering material, she entered her son's apartment carrying a thick envelope, tucked neatly inside her Hermes bag as though it were evidence in a federal trial. You need to see this, she said, placing the envelope on the glass table in the living room. Landon hesitated, then opened it. Inside were photographs of Isabella speaking to different men at bookstores, in cafes, and in the Harvard Library. Some were business people, politicians, and a few well-known investors. Actors Vivian had paid tens of thousands of dollars to impersonate. There were audio clips, fragmented and ambiguous. A behavioral finance report fabricated with precision painted Isabella as duplicitous, with a hidden agenda. To get close to Landon, seize wealth, and switch identities. Crueler still was a forged financial dossier showing Isabella had accessed Landon's private investment accounts, even though he had once given her that access when they moved in together. Landon sat frozen. I can't just believe all this because you say so, he said, trembling. It could be a misunderstanding. No, Landon, Vivian replied, not raising her voice. This isn't intuition. This is data. That night, when Isabella came home and hung her coat on the rack, she instantly felt something wrong. Landon stood in the living room, the envelope open, photos scattered like evidence of betrayal. Did you meet with any of these men? He asked, his voice low, sharpened like stone against steel. Isabella glanced at the photos, then back at him. You think I've betrayed you? She asked. Can you explain? Explain what? That I've been followed? That someone staged this entire thing because your mother doesn't like me? Or do I have to spin another lie to keep this love alive? You're saying every man in these pictures is random? No. I'm saying they were planted. I don't know these people. I exchanged pleasantries, that's all. I haven't cheated. I haven't used you. Landon said nothing. His silence was worse than any accusation. And what about everything else? He finally asked. Your real name? Your family? Where did you study? Who are you, Isabella? She turned her face away. Not from shame, but because the pain clawing at her throat was too much. Do you know what hurts the most? She whispered. Not the photos. Not your mother. But you didn't ask me before believing them. Because you've never told me the truth. And because you've never trusted me enough to give me the chance. The room fell silent. The glass walls were still transparent, but now they only reflected two people who no longer recognized each other. What do you want, Isabella? Landon asked, voice deep and hollow. I want you to ask me one question. Do I love you? And when I say yes, I want you to believe that more than anything else. But how can I know it's true, when everything else has been a lie? The words cut like a blade. She stepped to the table, removed the small engagement ring he had given her while they watched the sunset in Maine, and placed it down. I want nothing from you, Landon. No money, no apology, no second chance. I only wanted you to understand. I never needed your wealth, only your trust. She walked out of the apartment, her heels striking the hardwood like the closing echo of a door that once held hope. Boston lay shrouded in fog that night, and high above, in that glass tower, Landon Hayes stood among the fabricated photographs and lost the only real thing he had ever held. And in that moment, love did not die from betrayal, but from something far more terrifying: doubt. The Suffolk Superior Court in Boston was as grey that morning as the mood of those present at an unannounced divorce hearing the press had not yet discovered. Outside, passers-by were unaware that inside a courtroom on the 11th floor, a verdict was about to be delivered not for a crime, but for the failure of a man who chose to believe suspicion over the woman who had abandoned an entire world just to be loved sincerely. Landon Hayes, hair neatly combed, clad in an ash-grey suit, sat beside his mother and his lead attorney, Richard Faulkner, senior partner at Faulkner & Jessup, a firm specializing in high-asset divorces across New England. In their hands lay a prepared settlement proposal. The plaintiff agrees to provide the defendant post-marital financial support for $50,000 on the condition that the defendant withdraws from all real estate, shares, or any entitlements tied to Hayes Holdings trust funds. The defendant shall have 60 days to vacate the current condominium owned by the plaintiff. Cold words written by someone who had never truly loved her. Yet Isabella did not bow her head to such ice. She entered the courtroom in a minimalist dark grey dress, her hair tied back, face bare of makeup, but her quiet poise and authority silenced the room. No one here knew she was the sole heir to Cross Dominion Media Group, a $14 billion media empire spanning news networks, studios, and papers across the continent, or the daughter of Charles Cross, one of Wall Street's most powerful names. Her lawyer, Elizabeth Monroe, a public defender she had chosen at random, instead of hiring her army of counsel, whispered, "We can reject this. Under Massachusetts community property law, we can demand a 50-50 split of all Hayes' marital assets." Isabella smiled faintly. "I didn't come for money." Judge Catherine Medina, a woman in her 60s with 3 decades of family court experience, began reading the documents. She turned each page with silver-rimmed glasses and a steady, firm voice. "Mr. Hayes has declared total existing assets including controlling shares in Hayes Clean Energy, real estate holdings in Austin, Savannah, and Boston, totaling $126 million, personal investment accounts of $88 million, bank and credit accounts of $9.2 million, plus undisclosed inheritance assets estimated at $350 million. Landon lifted his head, awaiting the nod of victory. But then, the judge's tone shifted. As for Mrs. Hayes, also known legally as Isabella Gray, whose true legal name is Isabella Eleanor Cross, Landon froze. His eyes darted to his mother, whose face had gone pale. The judge pressed on, unmoved. Declared as the lawful daughter and sole heir of Charles Franklin Cross, current Cross Dominion Media Group CEO. Declared assets include controlling shares valued at $8.3 billion, trust funds of $3.1 billion, and personal and real estate assets totaling more than $2.2 billion across major US, European, and Asia cities. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence in which the clerk's pen tapping was audible. Landon sat stunned. The room spun. His mother covered her mouth, while Faulkner shot to his feet like a man realizing he had just shot his own client in the leg. The judge remained steady, unswayed. The total confirmed assets of Miss Cross exceed $13.6 billion. I verify that she is not Isabella Gray, as filed on the marriage license. However, her use of an assumed identity was not intended for financial gain, caused no material loss to the plaintiff, and has been shown by the defendant to have been motivated by personal privacy concerns. Isabella rose, her gaze locked on Landon. "Your Honor," she said calmly, I formally renounce all legal rights to any assets belonging to Mr. Landon Hayes. I am not here for money. I am here to close a chapter of my life with dignity and a heart once betrayed." The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Miss Cross, you understand that by law, you could claim half of the marital assets accrued. Over $260 million could be awarded." "I understand, and I want not a dollar." Isabella signed the divorce decree with one firm stroke of her pen. Landon stood, unable to contain himself. You're Charles Cross's daughter?" His voice cracked. "Yes. You're worth billions? And still I chose to live with you in an 800 square foot apartment, eating ramen at midnight, working as a barista to avoid recognition. I chose you when I could have chosen anyone. Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to know if you could love a woman with no fortune, name, or family crest, only herself. And you once did." "Isabella." She shook her head, her voice soft yet unyielding. "No, Landon. You didn't ask. You chose to believe others instead of me. Not because you didn't know, but because it was easier to believe the worst of me than to risk being hurt again." He stepped toward her, but she stepped back. "Thank you for once loving me. And thank you for showing me that not all love is strong enough to survive doubt." She turned and walked away. She did not wait for the ruling. She did not wait to be called by name. And the moment the courtroom door closed behind Isabella Cross, the woman who gave up $260 million to preserve her honor, everyone inside finally understood. The one most deeply wounded in this love story was never the one who needed saving, but the one no one dared to trust. Isabella Cross left the courthouse without bodyguards, press, or one following. She walked back into the world under her actual name, the name she once hid as a burden, no longer as a mask. The Boston afternoon sun fell on her shoulders like a new layer of light, not to conceal, but to reveal. In the taxi to her temporary apartment in Brookline, she received a single message, not from Landon, his parents, or anyone who had doubted or abandoned her. The message came from an anonymous account. "You did what no one in our world has dared to do, and you still held your head high. We need you. Will you return and use that name to do what's right?" See, she knew at once who it was. Clara Yuen, editor-in-chief of the Republic Post, an independent paper once owned by Cross Dominion, but sold after Charles Cross cut funding for investigative teams, exposing racial injustice and gender discrimination in American politics. Clara had once sent Isabella a draft investigation about Central American children forced into labor at U.S. fashion supply chains inside border detention centers, an article killed by higher-ups. Isabella had stayed silent then, quietly funneling money from her trust to fund lawyers protecting those children. But now, she was no longer the one in the shadows. Days later, Isabella flew to Oakland, where Clara and a team of independent editors were rebuilding the Republic Post in an abandoned print warehouse. It was no glossy newsroom, just pin-covered maps, marking places where people of color, immigrants, and LGBTQ+ communities had been erased from American history, from Memphis to El Paso, from Ferguson to Anchorage. Clara waited, holding a dossier of their new investigation. "The people erased from America." "Isabella Cross," Clara said, "are you ready to step into the light, not to build your father's empire, but to dismantle it?" Isabella stayed silent. Then she stepped forward and signed a full funding contract for the project, but with one condition: her name would not appear on the paper. No brand, no backed by Cross, only truth and justice. Meanwhile, in Savannah, Landon Hayes sat alone in a lakeside cabin. His mother, Vivian, had returned to Texas after a so-called victory vacation, never realizing she had lost her son. Landon had not grown used to the hollow in his chest, not from losing a wife, but from losing the only chance he'd ever had to believe in a love beyond wealth, lineage, and family history. He found an old letter Isabella had once written, hidden in a book, never sent. "If one day you discover I am not the person you thought I was, I hope it won't destroy the memory of the woman you once loved. I don't need to be believed, only to be understood." For the first time, Landon wept, not because he had lost the woman he loved, but because he realized he had not been brave enough to protect her when one honest question might have changed everything. The following month, Isabella appeared at a gathering in San Diego, where young social activists spoke about the future of justice-driven journalism. She did not speak. She sat in the back row, silent, but her presence alone, quiet and unwavering, made heads turn. And in an unsigned editorial, the Republic Post wrote, "She doesn't need to stand before cameras. She doesn't need to reclaim or defend her name. Her silence is the loudest affirmation for a generation. That honor is not about who believes you, but about living true without needing their belief." On her red-eye flight back to New York, Isabella booked her ticket under her real name for the first time in years. She no longer needed a mask, because true honor does not come from what you carry but from what you are brave enough to let go. 6 months after the Boston trial, Isabella Cross stepped back into the public eye, not as an orphaned student, a wounded wife, or the anonymous heiress the press once speculated about. She returned under her own name, and this time, she chose to do what no one in the Cross family had ever dared, to establish an independent justice media platform, entirely non-commercial, non-profit, and free from corporate control. Its name was Project Threnody, a name evoking the mourning songs once sung by black communities for the nameless dead. It was not a newsroom, but an ecosystem that included scholarships to train young journalists from marginalized communities, a legal defense fund for whistleblowers across industries, a censorship-free publishing platform powered by blockchain, untouchable by any conglomerate. At the first press conference in New York, Isabella stood on a small stage inside an abandoned theater once used by Jewish immigrant performers. She wore a plain white shirt, no designer labels, only a navy handkerchief, a keepsake once belonging to the mother of a migrant girl she had secretly helped in El Paso. She did not begin with an introduction, but with a quote from James Baldwin: "There is no such thing as a separate life. We live in one another, even when we deny one another." The room fell silent. "The day I gave up my identity, I knew my name no longer belonged to me," Isabella said. "It was something others used to build empires, buy power, and silence truth. But today, I reclaim that name not to continue the tradition, but to break it." She revealed her entire inheritance, $13.6 billion, and announced she would transfer 90% of it into a social justice trust, managed by an independent council with representatives from indigenous, LGBTQ+, immigrant, and legally marginalized communities. The shock rippled across America's financial and media industries. Bloomberg called her the anti-heir. Forbes ran with "the woman who gave up love, empire, and billions to rewrite history in her own name." But for Isabella, what she reclaimed was not wealth or fame. It was her voice and the right to use it without distortion. A week later, Landon Hayes read the report in a small café in Denver, where he had gone to escape media fallout after the Cross Dominion scandal. The man who once held the world in his hands now carried only an old backpack and a job application as a sustainable investment advisor for a modest Colorado fund. Landon bowed his head when he saw the words Project Threnody alongside Isabella's smile and a Guatemalan child she had helped secure release from detention. He knew he had not only lost a woman, he had lost a revolution he could have been part of. A week later, he sent a letter not by email, not by text, but by hand, to the new headquarters of Project Threnody in Brooklyn. "Isabella, I once thought you hid something because you did not trust me. Now I understand you hid it because you did not believe you could be trusted. I am sorry for doubting you and for lacking the courage to stand by you when you needed me most. If you cannot forgive me, I understand. But if one day you want someone to help build the world you are creating with honest hands and a heart that has learned repentance, I will still be here. L." She did not reply. But 3 weeks later, in an interview, when asked, "Do you believe those who once turned their backs on you deserve a second chance?" Isabella answered, "We have all been the villain in someone else's story. I don't need them to come back and apologize to me. But if they dare to come back and live differently, then perhaps the world is not as hopeless as we think." The interviewer paused, then asked, "You speak as if you still love them." Isabella smiled softly for the first time since the trial. "Love does not mean holding on," she said. "Sometimes love means letting them walk the path they once refused to take with you. And once again, The room fell silent. This was not out of persuasion, but because Isabella Cross had made people believe that her return was not to restore her reputation, but to wield her name as a blade against the unjust legacy that had imprisoned generations. This time, she wore no mask. This time, she carried both memory and fire. On a freezing December morning, Isabella Cross stood before an abandoned factory in East Detroit, once the largest General Motors auto parts plant in the 1,960 seconds. This place had fed thousands of black families before it was shuttered in the waves of automation and outsourcing. She wasn't there for a photo op. She was there because of a promise. To meet the past of America, the people who had never been powerful enough to tell their own story. In her hand was a file of 23 women who had worked 20 years on welding and paint lines, who had suffered unrecorded workplace injuries, who had filed for benefits only to be denied because their contracts did not meet official work-hour requirements. They were never called former employees, because they were never recognized as employees at all. The Threnody Archives Project, founded by Isabella, existed to honor people like them, the souls who built the foundations for someone else's dreams. At that day's community dialogue, an older woman rose to speak. Gloria Matthews, 78, dark-skinned, frail, was once the team leader of the final E5 paint line. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. We don't need monuments. We don't need thank you notes. We want the younger generation to know that people died in silence so that you could live loud. Isabella stepped forward and clasped Gloria's hand. No speech, no performance. Just a deep bow before a foundation the world had trampled to build its light. Crest. In the following weeks, Project Threnody spread to 17 states, gathering more than 12,000 testimonies from workers, teachers, nurses, domestic helpers, delivery drivers, people the system had deliberately forgotten. All were stored through immutable encryption and uploaded to an open platform with free global access. The first articles from the new storytellers, young journalists, trained under Isabella's scholarships, shook the nation. An exposé on how multiple cities used AI to monitor social workers but never applied it to police. An undercover report from Mississippi revealed that 3 out of 5 water plants in black-majority neighborhoods used substandard disinfectants. A short documentary series, Kitchen Prisons, tells the lives of hundreds of Mexican immigrant women forced into unpaid labor in Texas fine dining restaurants. There were no PR campaigns, no marketing teams. Yet Project Threnody erupted like fire breaking through dry earth. In Washington, conservative lawmakers called for investigations into social agitation through non-governmental information. One senator declared, "We cannot allow one individual, even Isabella Cross, to become a parallel information power against the state." But they misunderstood. Isabella never wanted to be a power. She only wanted to restore what America had erased, the memory of the nameless. In a rare interview, when asked why she chose Detroit, a place with no remaining commercial value, as Threnody's hub, she answered, "Because here, people once produced the things that made America move, but no one asked who produced them, and I want the world to start asking that question." Meanwhile, in Boston, the old apartment once shared by Isabella and Landon Hayes had a new tenant, a young Somali woman who had received a Cross Foundation journalism scholarship. She was drafting her first piece for Threnody, "What My Deported Mother Left Me." She didn't know that in the small wooden cabinet beside the kitchen, a slip of paper remained left by Isabella. If one day you feel unheard, write. If your voice is cut off one day, begin again from the start. And if they call you a breaker of order, smile, because that order was never yours to begin with. Signed, I. Cross. A woman was once called a liar, but she only tried to rewrite how the world sees the forgotten. And at that moment, a new generation began to write, tell, and speak, no longer afraid, because they knew someone had already paid with love, honor, and loneliness, so they could speak without needing permission. Winter in Charleston wasn't as cold as in Boston, but the salty chill of the coastal winds made everything feel quieter, slower. Inside an old riverside house on the Ashley once, the Cross family's summer estate more than half a century ago, Isabella sat by the fireplace, holding a letter, the only letter she had kept for an entire year. It was Landon Hayes' letter. She had opened it once, read every line carefully, then tucked it away like a relic that could neither be destroyed nor touched again. But that evening, as a misty drizzle clung to the windows like memories unwilling to fade, she opened it again for the first time with eyes no longer clouded by anger. At that moment, across the country, Landon sat inside a small wooden cabin in the Colorado mountains. He no longer wore suits, chased investment indexes, or appeared at economic forums. After losing dignity and love, he had withdrawn from that world and began again with small things, planting vegetables, writing in journals, and offering financial advice to agricultural cooperatives. One evening, while reviewing the portfolio of a charitable fund, a name caught his eye: Matthews Fund, Threnody Rural Justice Fund, providing free legal aid in environmental lawsuits across poor, mostly indigenous communities. The fund had just purchased an old printing house in Telluride, where Landon now lived. The signatory on the funding papers, I.E. Cross. His chest tightened, not from surprise, but from something rarer hope, the very thing he had once lost, returning in its quietest form. Ashend. A month later, Isabella was in Telluride for a closed seminar with environmental justice lawyers. She didn't sit in the front row. She didn't announce her presence. But when the session ended and the crowd dispersed, he was there. No flowers, no rehearsed words, just a gaze that didn't look away. "You don't need to forgive me," Landon began. "I just want you to see that I'm still alive and trying to become the man you once believed I could be." Isabella didn't answer right away. The cold wind brushed through her hair, but her eyes warmed like fire. "How long have you been living inside regret?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, long enough to realize. The truth doesn't need to defeat anyone. It only needs someone brave enough to hold on to it when everyone else has let it go. "And you think I still hold that truth for you?" "No," he said. "You hold it for yourself. I'm just asking to step back into that light, not to fix the old, but to build something new, if you'll allow it." They stood in silence. No embrace, no promises. No one said the word forgiveness because it was too late and unnecessary. But in Isabella's eyes, something had shifted. Olan. Months later, on a snowy afternoon across Colorado's plateau, people saw the two inside that old printing house, sweeping dust from shelves, assembling presses, sorting local archives. A bearded man in a worn jacket, a graceful woman, no longer hiding her fatigue. They weren't a power couple. They weren't a symbolic comeback. They were simply two people who had hurt each other so deeply they once believed they could never face each other again, yet somehow found the courage to stand not before their past, but before the most genuine parts of themselves. In her journal that late winter, Isabella wrote, "There are fractures no apology can mend. There are trusts too dead to be revived with flowers or gifts. But there are also people who, when brave enough not to run from their own shadows, become the last shelter for the very heart they once wounded." She did not forgive. He did not kneel. They stood up together, inside the fragility this world taught them to call real love. A love that didn't need perfection, only truth and breath. Spring returned to the wildflower-covered slopes of Telluride, as gently as if no winter had ever frozen the hearts of two people who had endured the harshest years of their lives. In the old printing house, now transformed into a community memory archive, Isabella Cross sat at a pinewood table, listening to a 15-year-old Navajo girl speak about her grandmother, who had died in silence from industrial waste in the Four Corners. There were no cameras, no sensational headlines, no newspapers calling her the rebellious heiress or the woman who gave up $260 million for honor. She no longer needed that. And for the first time in years, she felt that was true freedom. Landon Hayes was now so ordinary that no one would have recognized him as the man once splashed across the covers of financial magazines. He grew vegetables, taught sustainable heating techniques to indigenous families, and worked with local youth to build solar power systems for mountain schools. Every morning, he brewed coffee for the print house, just like Isabella liked. Strong, no sugar, a twist of orange peel. Every evening, he repaired jammed presses with a patience he didn't know he possessed. Perhaps he had learned it from her. They did not get back together in the way people expected. No remarriage, no press release proclaiming we forgave each other. They didn't need that. because in silence, they had rebuilt something more substantial than a relationship, a bond forged in living for something larger than themselves. They shared dinners, wrote reports, traveled for community work, never labeling what it was. Sometimes, they still argued. There were days Isabella would not speak to him at all, like when he accidentally read her draft before she was ready. But that night, he left a handwritten note on her desk. "I know I'm still learning to love you in a language that doesn't use words." She read it and said nothing. But the next morning, she brewed his coffee without the orange peel. Landon smiled. He understood. That was forgiveness, in her own way. At a forum in Seattle, someone asked about the next chapter of Isabella Cross's journey. She answered, "I don't know how far I'll go. But I know this. I'm no longer walking alone." Another voice rose. "Are you and Landon Hayes back together?" She smiled. "I don't think we ever truly left each other. We were only separated by the things the world thought were more important than truth, until we found our way back, through the truth itself." The room fell silent, not from surprise but from emotion. On a calm afternoon that summer, they held a small gathering by a lakeside. No priest, no wedding feast. Just 8 people, the very ones they had helped while building Project Threnody. They stood facing each other. No wedding dress, no diamond ring. Only 2 pairs of eyes. Eyes that had once hurt, once wept, once turned away, now returning. Isabella looked at him and said softly, "I don't need a promise that you'll never hurt me again. I only need you to dare to stay when the hurt comes." He nodded, placing a hand on his chest. "And you don't need to trust me absolutely. You only need to know that I will always choose to believe in you, even when you doubt yourself." They embraced. No applause, no cheers, only the wind, and light, and the peace they had once given everything to find. Isabella Cross and Landon Hayes did not rewrite a fairy tale. They lived a true story where flawed people still chose to love, not to fill emptiness, but to prove. Love is not a destination. Love is the courage every day to step toward the other, even when the world tells you to turn away. And that was the final chapter, not because the story ended, but because they no longer needed to prove anything at all.